OpenAI, where she led projects on bias and social impacts research, as well as public policy. Her research includes AI value alignments, responsible releases, and combating misuse and malicious use. She was named as one of MIT Tech Review's 35 Innovators Under 35 last year for her research. Irene, it's such a pleasure to have you here. Over to you.
Thank you, Kuan Yi. I'm very excited to speak about the role of openness. I've thought about this field since it really started becoming a field. And first I want to define with you, what does openness mean? I've been part of a lot of convenings and conversations, and the word openness tends to be thrown around in different ways. So first, I've heard it in a sort of parallel to open source software. There are some parallels that we can take, but fundamentally, there are distinctions. The Open Source Initiative has a working group that's working towards a definition for how open source applies to AI. My former colleague, Nathan Lambert, who's now at AI2, also has a great blog where he outlines why it's so difficult for the community to converge on a definition. In more of the national security community, I've heard openness be referred to model weights specifically, particularly the wide availability of model weights, whether that's available at all and how it's distributed. What I've heard alluded to, but maybe not made as explicit, is openness in the sense of transparency. Stanford University established a transparency index, and part of the big takeaway for me on that is how unclear what transparency means to different people, the weight that we give to weights, and many different aspects of systems that contribute to its openness. The definition that I am most partial to is moving past model centrism, is thinking about systems holistically and the many artifacts that contribute to an overall AI system. I'm going to do what slide presenters should not do and show you so many words and so many graphics on a slide, but what I really want you to take away from this image here is just how many artifacts contribute to an overall system when we're thinking about not just the model, but data sets. Are we thinking about fine-tuning data sets, feedback data sets? What might be is adjacent to a system, such as evaluation data sets? What does that mean to make it available when we have this fear of testing on training data? These images came from a convening hosted by Mozilla in February of this year at Columbia University on openness, and fostering this community of outlining dimensions of openness can help us better think through what are the artifacts outside of a model that contribute to how we release a system, the way that we threat model a system, and the way that people benefit and the research community can benefit from openness. This figure is part of that report that came out in May of this year, gives a non-exhaustive list of some motivations towards openness. I found it helpful to just be very explicit, very clear onto why some researchers are pursuing openness. Again, parallels with software, that we are able to share knowledge, to Dr. He's point, to have more perspectives, more expertise across the board. In the little time that I have with you today, I want to zoom in on two areas for AI safety and how it relates to openness. The first is viewing AI as a scientific discipline. In context, I've heard AI discussed as a commercial product, as a national security threat, and I think importantly, as a scientific discipline. This whole field really was founded on open science. The most popular example being given is the 2017 Attention is All You Need paper, and not just looking at papers, but also tools and libraries such as PyTorch. I don't think we'd be where we are today without an open science ecosystem. And the second part is really dear to my heart, is community contributions and the importance of broader perspectives. On the science point, it's really hard to decide what constitutes science. In the biological space, we know that there are lab coats and there are test tubes, but in the AI world, some aspects of science that I can give is around reproducibility. There's a sort of reproducibility crisis now, not just in what people are able to replicate, build up off of, but also in what access people have to models, the level of infrastructure that they have to reproduce results, verify it for themselves. It does affect trust in the research ecosystem. A broader issue in the field is peer review and publication. There's been too many issues with peer review to list on this stage, maybe a different conversation. But who is able to review the depth of what is being published and where. I do think that archive is a net good, and there's been some concerns raised about what does this mean for the integrity of what is peer-reviewed before it is shared with the community. Relatedly is scientific communication, which can also include documentation, and again, interdisciplinarity, which brings me to the importance of broader contributions. I want to make sure that this phrase really resonates. No one organization, regardless of how large, well-resourced, diverse it is, could possibly host all of the different expertises, perspectives, and views of the people affected to make that system as safe as possible to the many populations that it affects. Some examples that I give are around external scrutiny. There was an open letter earlier this year calling for a safe harbor for independent AI evaluation, and some more concrete examples are showing how access to artifacts can enable better research. I really appreciate this work by Dr. Abebe Berhane that is really foundational to the field of evaluating large-scale data sets. This work would not have been possible without access to something like Lion. To many points echoed today, and I believe Professor Gao shared earlier, multilinguality is a big part of how I think we can move forward on international collaboration. This table is from my research collaborator, Dr. Zirak Talat's work, and ongoing with Big Science hosted by Hugging Face. It's really exemplifying the importance of having an open collaboration and having contributors from many different language backgrounds. They found in this work on the challenge of multilingual evaluations how much English is overrepresented, and their upcoming work is working with native speakers of different languages to examine those different biases by languages. Some languages, such as French and Spanish, will have more gendered terms. I unfortunately speak very limited different Asian languages, but there's different relationships with families that we don't have in Western languages, for example, that would introduce different safety challenges. I published this last year. I want to move into the conversation around what should be open, what does open governance look like, and where risk is introduced based off of openness and release. This spectrum was meant to go past the binary of open and closed. When we're thinking about open, I'm leaning more towards that sort of downloadable access, but fully open makes that distinction of having more artifacts be available. So some examples would be last year OPT by Meta was downloadable, but it was really hard to access that data set, so it would not be fully open, for example. But Eleuther AI has done incredible fully open work, made all of their artifacts fully accessible. And then I would put systems such as DALL-E more in the hosted access, that tends to be more in the closed proprietary area, but I wanted to give more dimension into how to think about this spectrum. In that work that I published last year, I wanted to be really clear that it is a collective responsibility to ensure that release goes well. There are many different steps that we can take, and a lot of overlap in the action that people can take together. I've been thinking more, and for the rest of this talk, I want to dive into beyond release. Once a system is deployed, the way that harm is actualized is not always dependent on how a system is released, but that can be an important variable. I appreciate what Dr. Nitzberg said earlier around capability often being conflated for, but not always being the right proxy for what risk is. That being said, capability does contribute to how we threat model. An example that I would give is Crayon, formerly known as DALL-E Mini. That was a diffusion model. It generated pretty hilarious, really blobby images, and that just was less threatening than something like a DALL-E 2 that generates really realistic images. So that's where that capability comes into play. At Hugging Face, we do have to moderate for content. I really want to stress the importance of content as present risk. This is what we think about, unfortunately, with non-consensual content, with disinformation, and something that we need to be thinking about holistically as capability and content. More of what I'm thinking about is what does it mean to actualize risk into harm? And I want to move the conversation past release, closed, not closed, open, into access versus barriers to access. So while you might have an open weight model, and yes, you can remove those safeguards, some work led by Dr. Peter Henderson, this is from a Stanford policy brief, he's now at Princeton University now, shows that with fine-tuning APIs, you can do the same thing that you can with open weight models. So hosting closed weight models is not inherently safer. It's actually quite cheap to get rid of safeguards. And open weight models are not necessarily more accessible to people. Just an extremely compute-intensive model may not be accessible to people who don't have compute infrastructure, who don't have computer science skills. I have some more examples around early on this is not to pick on ChatGPT, but it just has such a broad reach early on because it had a really easy user interface. People who maybe didn't have computer science skills were able to generate malicious code. Maybe that wouldn't have been possible if they had to host it on their own infrastructure and query via an API like I had to in the Stone Age of 2019 when I worked at OpenAI. So in the context of China, we've been really privileged to host some open models by Chinese companies. This is from the last version of the version 2 of Hugging Face's open leaderboard. We just revamped it, and Quen2 has marked very high across the board. It's been really interesting to see Chinese model contributions to the open ecosystem. And in the context of global AI safety, I want to give some examples of this, the Singapore one should say IMDA, of the kinds of work that governments are taking to move forward openness, particularly around consortiums, around the, I believe it's Inspect by the UK government. I was really glad to see them open source that. And as Dr. He said, around Project Moonshot, I'm really looking forward to work by the French government. I really appreciated Dr. Verroco's emphasis on openness, what it means for innovation, avoiding that concentration of power, and how we can work as a global network. Moving forward, and as part of our panel, I do want to dig into what does that look like for the research space, for startups to be part of this conversation. To be very frank, high-level dialogue is not always accessible to researchers who don't have a lobbying arm, but have really good insights into what is technically feasible. And selfishly, since I come from a startup, it's top of mind for myself as well. Thank you so much. I hope this was informative for you, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much, Irene, for your presentation that shed light into the nuances and complexities of openness in AI development and safety.